That lives is designed to end. We are perpetually trapped in a never-ending spiral of life and death.
Hello everyone. NieR Automata is a game I've heard heralded as one of the greatest games ever made. There are many things about this game that might lead people to that conclusion. Its intentionally gray and artificial atmosphere mixed in with the nature of the world. A storyline that is uniquely divided into 5 different routes, that all stand on their own, each having their own credit sequence, while still going in chronological order of the story, and gameplay that flirts with many different styles and genres, are all reasons why people might say this is one of the greatest games ever made. But for me, it isn't so black and white. NieR Automata has a lot of great moments, but it also has a lot of shortcomings. The question I want to answer today is, with all the uniqueness that NieR Automata has with its story, gameplay, and presentation, how successful is it throughout the entire game at doing that? This will be split into 4 major sections. The A route, which is the first section of the game, starring 2B, first android you take control of, then obviously going chronologically with the game's routes. The B route starring 2B's sidekick 9S, the C and D route, which stars the previous 2 protagonists and the new rogue, Android A2, and then finally the game's conclusion in the E route. From here on out, there will be major spoilers for the entire game, so be warned if you haven't played it yet, as this video is mostly meant for people that have finished NieR Automata or at least have a good understanding of it. Last thing I want to mention is that within the sections of this video, although story will be talked about in chronological order, gameplay will be talked about as a whole. So when I start talking about the flying sections in the A route, I'll be talking about my thoughts on them as a whole. So if you see footage from another route, that's almost certainly intentional. This will likely be my only video on NieR Automata, but if you like the video anyway, I ask that you like and subscribe, as it would mean a lot. Without any further ado though, let's discuss NieR Automata. NieR Automata is an action RPG, which of course is a blending of the action and the RPG genre. So it'll have stats and level up systems like an RPG, while also having first-hand combat like an action game. This is most definitely the main gameplay of NieR Automata. But the game does not start out with this gameplay. Instead, it starts with one of the side gameplay modes, a top-down shooter with fighter jets. So before I start on the main gameplay, I want to cover that first. If you have ever played Galaga before, there's a lot of similarities between this game mode and Galaga. It's obviously not one-to-one though, as NieR Automata has a lot more complexity. You can do melee and range combat, much like the main action gameplay. NieR Automata will also flip the camera angle, so you have to fight the enemies in a different perspective. These different camera angles definitely make the gameplay a lot more interesting. And that definitely helps a lot, as there are a lot of sequences just like this throughout the game. These are most often used when you're trying to go from one set piece to the next, or for some story reason like fighting a giant robot. These sections are pretty fun, but there is one slight issue. They are very long. For example, the first section of the game took me about 6 minutes on a repeated playthrough to get through the first section. That might not sound like too much to you, but this is one of the shorter sections of the game where you're in the fighter pilots. And the gameplay, while fun, mostly just consists of you holding the R button to shoot, while flying around and holding the attack button to attack the enemies. And unlike the main combat, there really isn't a way to differentiate the way you attack the enemies. I will admit that the long length might be intentional though, and it's meant to show how far you have to go to get from one place to the next. So although they probably could have been condensed a little bit, I did like their inclusion and found them to be enjoyable. Now let's talk about the main gameplay of NieR Automata. As I said before, NieR Automata is an action RPG. Although the combat has elements of both, I definitely say it leans more heavily on the action side. I say this because a lot of the elements of RPGs don't really make a big impact. For example, there are level up systems, but NieR Automata makes it so that no matter how much side quests and grinding enemies you do, you will be able to progress to the next point of the game. That way, completionists that want to do all the side quests and content of NieR Automata beforehand will be able to play through the game without it being obnoxiously easy, and people that just want to play the main story won't find it obnoxiously hard. I like that the game is built around this. Although the RPG genre is one I definitely like, I don't want to do any unnecessary grinding if I don't want or have to. And that is also a reason why I couldn't get into a game like Final Fantasy VI, where a big chunk of the game's length is dedicated to grinding enemies to get your characters up to level. And that's why for this game I don't mind NieR Automata having more of an action approach, as I really like the level up system. Since levels don't really alter how good you are at fighting, they only slightly change your health and attack power, so it's reliant on you to be able to kill that tough robot. The combat itself is good and simple. There are two different types of combat you'll be using, range combat and melee combat. The range combat will be dealt from a robot firing gunfire that you can control. Depending on your difficulty selection, you will be able to either target onto these enemies to make it so that you can always hit them with the gunfire, as long as they're not moving around too much, or making it reliant on harder difficulties for you to aim correctly. A lot of the bigger bosses will require you to use this more than the melee combat, so harder difficulties will make those fights more engaging. There are several standard enemies that also require you to use only range combat, but the one that's shown on screen is an example of one that you basically want to have targeting because it flies around so fast that it's almost impossible to aim with the camera. However, easier difficulties allowing you to target also make it so you basically don't have to move at all to kill enemies. You can just let the camera do the job for you and let your pod shoot down the enemy. No matter if you were able to target or not, it's still a pretty cool system, as it gives your character the opportunity to attack even if you're trying to run away from an enemy or a boss. Melee combat is obviously the more exciting of the two. You get to attack the enemies up front with a pretty fast combat style. You have a normal attack button that attacks pretty fast, and you can hold it at different points to get a different combo. Some of the combos you can do can lift your enemy into the air and then slam down on them. You can also hold the attack button to extend your weapon and have it kind of boomerang back to you, and there are other possibilities just like that. There's also a second attack button that lets you do a stronger attack if you're 2B or A2. A drop-down menu that will let you heal or change weapons on the fly, and there is also a jump and dodge button where you can get out of the way of enemy attacks. But those buttons also have uses outside of combat. For those of you that are experienced with the action RPG genre, this really isn't that out of place. Heck, if you've played any Warriors game, this control scheme isn't that out of the ordinary. So it's not really that groundbreaking from a base level, but it's still a very fun combat system, although I do want to point out some of the flaws. Core combat being pretty simple isn't a bad thing, but when it comes to dodging enemies, it is. I tried the game on multiple difficulties, and no matter what I did, I could always just spam the dodge button and basically get hit not that much. The amount of times during my playthrough that I got multiple perfect dodges in a row just by spamming the same button over and over again really speaks to how easy it can be to dodge a lot of the attacks. The game itself isn't easy, as a lot of the bosses don't really fall victim to this flaw, but a good portion of regular enemies and some bosses do. Luckily for NieR Automata's sake, the game does a pretty good job of letting you balance your melee and range combat so you can do both of them at the same time. And that's how most of the fights work in NieR Automata, using both at once. And the fights that do make you use only one style of combat don't come that often, and when they do, it's usually for some story reason. With there being 3 different playable characters, each of them has a variant on the moveset. That helps them stand out from the other characters. So for this section, we're going to talk about 2B's moveset. Out of the 3, hers is definitely the best. She might have the more basic moveset of the 3, but her moveset just feels the best to play. Her special feature is that she can self-destruct, which does enormous damage to any enemy caught in the blast, while also bringing her down to low health. This is a pretty good feature, but it has a major flaw being pretty clunky to activate. To activate it, you have to hold the left and right stick buttons down for 3 seconds, which doesn't sound that terrible, but those buttons are the hardest to keep held down. The move itself is pretty situational as well, and since it brings your health way down, it's almost not even worth using. In the grand scheme of things, that's a pretty small nitpick though, because 2B's moveset does a really good job of making it exciting as all moves flow into each other very nicely. I don't think the other movesets are bad, but I think 2B's is the best one at being smooth. Before I talk bosses, I do want to mention another feature that NieR Automata has, the plug-in chip system. As you play NieR Automata, you'll get these chips that you can add onto your character that change a bunch of different things. They can boost your attack power, your defense power, how much health you have, and even letting parts of the game play on autopilot for you. You can manually set it to whatever you want to get every individual thing to your liking, or you can have it automatically set to be balanced, or you can make it so that it will favor a certain kind of upgrade like attack buffs. And as you progress more in the game, there will be more unlocked to you, but if you want more space to buff your character, you can actually take parts of the UI off to make room. Compared to level ups, the plug-in chip system does a lot more to buff your character than level ups do, as I'm pretty sure a lot of what level ups do is increase your capacity for more plug-in chips. This system is great. It lets me buff my character in the way I want. And even if the chips that play everything on autopilot don't really mesh well for me, I can easily just avoid them and not use them. I think it definitely succeeds at adding more character customization and adding more depth to the combat. And now let's finally talk boss fights. To be frank, if I looked at all the bosses in the game, they are pretty hit or miss. I'd like to say most of the fights are good, but when I really look at it, it's pretty split down the middle. I really enjoyed the bosses that had you fight against androids or other creatures around the same size as your character. Fights had a more personal feel to them, and the enemies themselves were a lot easier to keep track of. This is probably just a problem with me playing the game on Switch, but I also feel like the frame rate would dip less when I fought these types of enemies compared to the giant robots. And since hitting the smaller bosses are harder than the big ones, it felt a lot more rewarding to do damage to the smaller bosses. And I think it speaks volumes that my favorite fights in the game were the ones against A2/9S and Adam and Eve. The other type of fights I think worked really well are of course the high spectacle bosses. These bosses aren't really meant to be that tricky and are mostly there to be cool. Some of the high spectacle bosses do have a fair bit of complexity though, especially those that incorporate both the melee combat and the fighter jet combat. I don't really have too much to say in these bosses, they're just really cool. Obviously, since they're mostly there for spectacle, I wouldn't call these my favorite fights in the game, but they're definitely some of the more memorable ones for me. The other bosses, though, are okay. They're not all super bad, but they're pretty forgettable. The ones on screen right now are probably the most memorable out of the standard robot fights, but that's really only because they are repeated several times. Oftentimes, like right next to each other, like the first time you fight them, it's in a dark room. And it's a whatever fight, it's kinda dumb, but then you fight him again 5 minutes later, and it's ridiculously hard. This is probably the worst fight in the game because this comes after a story sequence where all the shops are taken away from you, so if you waste all your healing items on the first try, you can't get them back after death. So you are then forced to kill the boss with no healing items, and it's one of the most tough fights in the game. I legit would have quit this game if I didn't turn the difficulty down from normal to easy for that one fight. I know that's a lot of criticism about one fight in the entire game, but since it's repeated more than any other fight, I feel like it's a pretty big flaw. The other fights aren't as bad as that one, but they're not really that memorable. They're just kind of big robots say a fight. Again, there are some really fun and interesting fights in NieR Automata, but there's also just a lot of whatever fights. As I'm recording this, I'm actually struggling to find a different fight other than the types I've just mentioned that I actually really liked. There is one exception that's coming to my mind right now, and that's a fight against the opera singer in the beginning of the game. I probably sound pretty negative right now. When I talk about boss fights, I'm only talking about boss fights. NieR Automata also has a lot of cool sequences where you fight a lot of enemies. It's just a little disappointing that a lot of the fights that aren't in those big sequences or in the categories of bosses that I like were pretty disappointing and had a lot of filler. I do want to clarify that the good outweighs the bad here. It's just that the bad has a lot of filler bosses that aren't fun and are very frustrating. For now, that's all I want to say about combat. I got a couple more stuff to say a little bit later into this video, but for now, I want to talk about the world of NieR Automata, and I really don't have any complaints. All the areas in NieR Automata are really cool and varied. One of the first places you visit is probably my favorite in the game. This is a sort of hub where all the androids live, and in contrast to the colorful world on Earth, the space colony is very dull and gray, and it perfectly matches the colors of the androids who built it. The main area of the game is called the Ruined City, which is what you would expect. A large city that has been taken over with fauna and trees now that humanity has been driven out of Earth. I really like how peaceful the area is in general, especially in contrast to the more energetic areas like the abandoned factory. The desert area, while being less memorable than the other ones, is still a really cool area that has its own section, like the apartment complex or the sand dunes that you can surf on. The carnival area is probably the prettiest one in the game. While being smaller than the other two Earth areas that I mentioned so far, it still has a lot of cool vistas and set pieces like being able to ride on a roller coaster ride to get to a boss fight. The abandoned factory is a really cool area as well. It incorporates a lot of elements that might have been used at the factory in the past, as well as giving it a very industrial feel to best match the robots that now inhabit it. This area is also the one with the most amount of set camera angles to best show the scale of the factory. The copied city and the tower both have very similar art styles, having the color white be the only color you really see, as well as having a very blocky design, which, similar to how the bunker characterizes the androids, these two areas do a good job of characterizing the robots. I would say that the forest area is just alright, but it has a castle at the end, so it's pretty cool. The flooded city, while showing some resemblance to the ruined city, is still a great area because you have to incorporate a lot more platforming due to a lot of the city being, you guessed it, underwater. And finally, the two major towns you visit while you're on Earth, one being populated by androids and the other one being populated by the peaceful faction of robots, both stand out from each other while giving a homey feel. All of these areas are great. And what's even better than that is that exploration within the world is very fast and to the point. The movement of the androids is very speedy, so you can run through the world and get from one area to the next. And as you revisit areas, the game is very generous with checkpoints that you can quick travel to, which reduces the amount of backtracking and makes the pace of the game better. NieR Automata's world is great. Movement within it is fast, all the areas are diverse, and they all tie into NieR Automata's major themes. Speaking of themes, let's now talk about the story of the A route. As a whole, my experience with NieR Automata's narrative was a positive one, but the quality of the story depends on which part of the game you're playing. And sadly, NieR Automata does not begin firing on all cylinders. It's not a case of making a bunch of mistakes, as the story of the A route is very solid. It does a decent job of introducing many of NieR Automata's major themes. Themes like the meaning of humanity and existentialism, and these themes are shown off when you go from place to place. As you see, all the different types of robots are beginning to imitate humanity. Robots like the ones you can find in Pascal's village who are attempting to live in a peaceful village, or the robots in the forest trying to run a political system. These themes are pretty well developed into the story. However, the story itself is pretty lacking. You pretty much just walk around and go places and then fight some robots until boom, some catastrophe happened and you have to go fight it. You are introduced to characters like Adam and Eve, who play as the villains of this route, Pascal, the leader of the peaceful robot village, and the commander of the androids who send 9S and 2B down to Earth. They are for sure introduced in this part of the story, but they really aren't as developed as they are in their later appearances in the game. Heck, even the main two, 9S and 2B, don't really get their time to shine here. Most of the good story moments in the A route are good solely because they are good setup for reveals later in the game. I can already hear the response to my criticism right now. The response you might be thinking right now is, well, the A route of NieR Automata is just the opening act, and therefore should not be held to the same level of quality as the later points in the game. Although this is true, NieR Automata is heavily marketed as being a very segmented game, as there are several credit sequences in between the beginning and the end of the game, and segmenting the game into routes A, B, C, D, and E is a staple of the game's director. However, I still wanted the story of the A route to be interesting, since that's the one that all people are guaranteed to play, and they could just as easily stop after they see the first credit sequence. And although it's definitely not as bad as I'm making it sound, it's still disappointing that the A route wasn't as interesting, especially because the game got so much better around the C route. I do want to talk about some stuff I like though. I really like the premise of NieR Automata. It's a war between androids and robots. The war started after aliens invaded Earth and drove humanity out. Robots are fighting for the aliens and the androids are fighting for humans so that humans can one day go back to Earth. Androids are arguably more powerful than the robots, but the robots are more numerous. Androids can also back themselves up after death with a new body, but lose all memories upon that death, which is something we see happen to 9S multiple times. And although the story at the beginning isn't anything to write home about, comparatively, I do like the great deal of foreshadowing that the A route gives us for the major reveals at the end of the game. I'm not going to talk about the reveals just yet, as they make the most sense to talk about as they come up in the story. I will say though that I love the subtle foreshadowing, as I did not see any of the major reveals coming. So to conclude, although this story of the A route intrigued me, at least with wanting to see how the story would go with its setup, but with a very slow-paced story and overall just not being as interesting as the later portions of the game, the A route failed to impress me on a narrative level. Instead of it being a continuation, the B route is basically just a new game plus version of the A route, where instead of playing as 2B, you play as her partner 9S. When it comes to combat, 9S's moveset compared to 2B's varies in one specific way. Where 2B has a light attack and strong attack move, 9S replaces a strong attack move with a hacking ability. When you activate it, it will bring up a top-down shooter minigame where you're trying to shoot pilots and take down a target, all the while having to avoid projectiles that the enemies send at you. If you get hit 3 times, you lose and damage is done to your character. However, if you succeed, the enemy will combust and probably die, or at the very least, doing a sizable amount of damage. That combustion will also do damage to nearby enemies, making it a very reliable way of killing enemies. Just like the main combat, you may or may not be able to target onto enemies. For me, I had a lot more fun playing this mode when targeting was turned off, as having targeting turned on for these modes meant that you could basically keep your ship in one place and just spam the target button, and 9 times out of 10 being able to get through without much trouble. I also like the variety in the different maps that your ships could be placed on. It is pretty similar to the airship shooter mode, however I much preferred playing this mode, as I appreciate its more simple design. But although I think the game mode itself is fun, I don't really like how it's incorporated into 9S's moveset, because choosing to activate the hacking minigame will completely interrupt the action that's going on. And since it's so useful, you'll want to use it as many times as you can, since it's great for crowd control. So for example, let's say you're in a room of about 10 robots. You'll probably want to use a hacking minigame anywhere between 5 and 7 times, so you can best lower the health of the robots in the room. So that's 6 to 7 times you have to do a 10 to 20-second minigame really adds up as you interrupt the more exciting gameplay. And since 9S isn't built for combat like 2B is, you're bound to use this a lot, making his moveset not as fun to play with as 2B. Moving on from 9S's moveset, there really isn't that much to talk about for the B route. It's pretty much just a New Game Plus mode, where instead of playing as 2B, you play as 9S. Whenever 9S is separated from 2B in the A route, there will be some different gameplay stuff, but it really isn't that substantial, except in one instance where you're controlling a bunch of robots to help 2B on the embedded factory section. Most of the time, though, it will just be 9S in a hacking minigame learning valuable information. As far as story goes, there are some new cutscenes. It is mostly just backstory on the bosses and situations you find yourself in as you play the game. These often appear randomly. It can just happen when you walk into a new area or after you kill a boss or something like that. These scenes add further context into why the robots are mimicking humans, as well as fleshing out the world more. For example, beating the opera singer this time around will now play a cutscene that further explains why the opera singer robot desires true beauty. By far the coolest additional cutscene in the B route takes place after the prologue. In the A route, this is where you'd set up your settings as 2B. 9S would guide 2B through this. The game would explain this as 2B needing to reapply her settings after she died in the prologue. So of course you would set your settings to your preferences. 9S will tell you that the entire thing is being recorded, but it seems like a throwaway line, so I didn't really pay attention to it on my first go around. So of course I decided to take as long as I possibly could on the settings menu and make 9S wait as long as he possibly can. But that thing about it being recorded wasn't a lie. In the B route, you're playing as 9S, so you have to watch yourself set up the settings, so if you took so long like I did, you have to watch the entire thing. It sounds pretty minor, but that is one of my favorite moments in the entire game, because it's so unexpected. You wouldn't expect the game to record the entire thing, because on a blind playthrough, you'd never expect the game to go back to that. And it also punishes you if you decide to dink around, and that's really funny. Although the C and D route have the strongest story moments, this route has my favorite, because this is pretty much the one scene that would explain why the game needed to be split into the A and B route, making you spend an entire playthrough with 2B, and then another playthrough that's pretty similar with 9S. This is pretty much the only moment that needed a separate playthrough to be fully appreciated. For example, let's look at the two major reveals of the B route. 1. After 9S is captured by Adam, he has a text conversation with him, which Adam will reveal that 9S wants to do something to 2B, with the something itself being blurred out. This can be taken at face value, just being a weird, dirty joke. It probably isn't, especially with how 9S acts later in the game. The second major reveal is right before the final battle of this section of the game. The reveal that humanity never actually escaped the moon and were wiped out when the aliens invaded, meaning that the entire conflict between the robots and android has been pointless the entire time, which is a great source of tension for 9S, as the commander will launch a massive attack against a robot army, even though they both know there is no point to it. Although both of these reveals are great and serve the story very well, they aren't really needed to be separated by different playthroughs. As we'll see, the C and D route will change which characters you're using depending on the point in the story. So it's weird why the first 2/3 of the game would require you to spend one playthrough on one character and one on the next, learning some new information on the different playthroughs, but only having one relevant cutscene that would only make sense across multiple playthroughs. It's weird why they couldn't just change the character you're using depending on the part of the story you're in, because the B route has some good reveals, and my opinion on the story would be much better if they were just merged and condensed into one route. If that would have been done, the beginning would have still been the weaker story moment, but it would have been much closer to the later portions of the game, which really makes me question why the A, B, C, D, and E routes were even required, other than being a director's staple, but I'll cover that more at the end. And now let's move on and talk about the C and D route. As we approach this point of the game, there really isn't that much gameplay left to talk about. However, there are still two things I want to bring up before getting into the story. First off, the final playable character, the rogue android A2, is introduced here. Her moveset is pretty good. It's more similar to 2B's than it is to 9S, making her much more fun to control in combat. Her moveset is pretty similar to 2B's, although there is an alteration to the self-destruct move. Instead of making an explosion that harms nearby enemies, she'll instead activate a sort of super mode that makes her more powerful until her health gets too low. I'm not really that big of a fan of either of these moves, but if I had to choose the one I prefer, I'd probably go with 2B's self-destruct, as that move works well in both regular enemy encounters and bosses, whereas I feel like A2's really only works well in bosses. But overall, both of the movesets are good, and I don't really have a huge problem with either of them. Last part of gameplay I want to talk about now is the fact that you can play as multiple characters in this route, because as you play, you'll be switching between 3 characters, 9S, A2, and 2B. I really don't have that much to comment on for this feature, other than it's really nice to have. One of my least favorite parts about the early game was having to have an entire second playthrough to play as 9S. So the fact that the game addresses this within the game itself and not in a sequel is really awesome, especially with the amount of times you switch characters at this point in the game. And that's pretty much all the gameplay I want to cover. So now, let's finish up the discussion on the story. The beginning of this route is very up in the air. There is still a lot of mystery between the situation with 2B and 9S, and at the same time, the commander of the androids is launching a full-on assault of the robots for no clear reason. So 2B, 9S, and the other androids go down to fight. All goes well for a time, but then the robots start corrupting all of the androids on Earth. 9S is unaffected due to being separated from the network that all androids are bound to, but the other androids are being corrupted, and 9S only has time to save 2B. The corruption basically takes all of the humanity out of the androids, and basically just turns them into weapons to kill the androids that are unaffected. 9S and 2B try their best to get back to the bunker to warn the people in space about what had happened. However, when they return, the commander does not believe them, as she is suspicious about the fact that 9S and 2B left their posts in the battlefield. Both of them try to warn her, but it's too late, as the infection has spread to the bunker, meaning all of the current androids of YorHa, minus 2B, 9S, and the commander, are now infected, and are essentially dead. The 3 eventually make their way to the hangar after fighting off the androids, but the commander too is infected. So before she is taken over by the robot hive mind, she sacrifices herself so that 2B and 9S can escape back down to Earth. So reluctantly, 2B and 9S escape from the bunker. Up to this point alone, the story was intriguing me, since within the intro of the C route, so many of the supporting characters are killed. But the shocking reveals of the opening don't stop here, as upon re-entering Earth, 9S and 2B are separated, and 2B is infected with the virus. Before she is taken over, she desperately tries to find a region with a signal that is out of range of any possible surviving androids, so they don't get infected as well. The actual game screen will get progressively more and more blurry and messed up as the infection spreads. 2B will begin to lose control of her abilities, making traversal a nightmare. What I like is how well presented this is. Instead of just telling you that 2B is infected, they literally show your UI and screen being messed up. And the progression too. It starts out relatively minor, but as you get closer to 100%, it just completely goes insane. This is definitely the best example in the game where NieR Automata plays with the UI and presentation, and I think it did a really good job in all the sections where it's handled. Eventually though, 2B does manage to reach the region she was looking for. Some of the corrupted androids begin to attack her, but then A2 comes to her aid. 2B gives A2 her memories, and then before the infection reaches her, A2 kills her out of mercy. That situation taking just long enough for 9S to see A2 kill 2B, and then vows to kill A2 out of revenge before being blown away by the bridge. And that is just the intro sequence. Not only did this intro kill many of the side characters, it also killed arguably the main character all within the first hour or so. In my opinion, that's pretty ballsy. and it definitely pays off because the story that follows is way more interesting, and my engagement was piqued. The section that follows is pretty non-linear. There are 2 sections for each of the surviving characters, and you can play them in any order. A2 section has her not really wanting to get involved with anything, but gets roped into helping Pascal and the peaceful robots and learning about their way of life. 9S's section has him going to towers that spawned around the world in hopes that he can decimate all of the robots. Surprisingly, the section with A2 is more interesting, so let's cover that first. A2's section, as previously mentioned, is about her getting to know the peaceful group of robots led by Pascal. As she helps out these robots, she begins to learn about their way of life, and from these interactions, begins to realize that not all the robots are mindless. But during this event, tragedy strikes the village. The previously peaceful villagers start attacking each other, leading to the entire village minus Pascal and the robot children being wiped out. The corrupting of the villagers probably was due to the robot hive mind of the more antagonistic robots. After defeating the corrupted villagers, A2 meets Pascal at the abandoned factory to hide away the surviving villagers. The safety doesn't last long as the robots track them down and attack them at the abandoned factory. The following segment has A2 and Pascal doing their best to fend them off. The initial bout of enemies is just a standard fight, then afterwards gets to one of the coolest spectacles in the game. Those giant titans that you fought earlier in the game, well now as Pascal, you get to control one. You plow your way through hordes of enemies with the massive robot titan, and after plowing through a bunch of enemies, you're led to another titan that you get to fight head on. This whole segment is honestly one of the coolest in the entire game. What elevates this section of the game isn't this spectacle, but the choice you have to make directly after. Before I talk about it though, I do want to say that although most of you watching have probably played the game and know what I'm going to talk about, I do want to say that the following scene has some heavy subject matter, so if you don't want to risk it, I recommend skipping to this timestamp I'm putting on screen. After returning from fending off the robots, A2 and Pascal return to find the robot children dead. The game explains that Pascal taught all of the people in the village, especially the children, emotions, one of them being fear. Pascal explains that he taught them that so that if anyone ever attacked the village, the robots would have the capacity to run. Sadly though, him teaching that had an unintended effect, leading the children to die of fright. Pascal is of course devastated by this, prompting you to make a choice. You were technically given 2 options, but there is a third that the game doesn't tell you about. None of these options have a happy ending though. Choosing to wipe Pascal's memory so he wouldn't remember this feels wrong. Choosing to kill Pascal also feels wrong. Choosing to do neither of these options also isn't a good outcome because now you're leaving Pascal to wallow in his shame. So no matter what you do, there is no happy ending here. This will be the last time you ever see Pascal in the game, unless you choose to wipe his memories, but even then it doesn't really feel like Pascal anymore. This is probably the most heartbreaking sequence in the game. I don't even think I can elaborate on this anymore. It's a heart-wrenching scene, and it's pretty hard to watch. Especially because you never expect that to happen with the events of the game so far, even if you include 2B dying. In contrast, 9S's section is a lot more simple. His section has him going to towers that sprouted up along the land, in hopes that will lead him to end up killing all the robots. So he goes to the towers in the forest, flooded city, and amusement park areas. That way he unlocks a path to get into the central tower in the abandoned city. It is good lead up to the climax, but outside of having to fight his former operator, there really isn't that much interesting story stuff to comment on. The final section of the game has 9S and A2 at separate times going into the final tower after it finally opened up. Now at this point in the game there are several reveals, and this is also where the game switches characters the most. To stop 9S, they send a bunch of corrupted 2B models in order to stop him. 9S manages to defeat all of them, but the 2B models use a self-destruct in order to try to kill 9S. The explosion takes off one of his hands, forcing him to use one of the 2B model hands in order to replace it, which inflicts him with the logic virus, and that will become more important at the end. A2 manages to get herself hacked into by the main robot villain. No matter how many of the enemies that A2 defeats in this section, they will just keep multiplying and multiplying. The only way A2 manages to win is by not attacking any of them, letting them grow to such an exponential size that they eventually start disagreeing with how they should deal with A2 and 9S, leading to the minds of the robots to start fighting against each other, eventually all of them killing each other off, leaving A2 the opportunity to kill the last one. After climbing the tower and getting both of their ways up to the top, they meet for the first time since 2B's death, and 9S, who is inflicted with the logic virus, has no intention of talking things out. Before the fight, however, there is one final major reveal. Well, technically 2, but the reveals are really about the same thing. Since humanity is destroyed and there is no point to fighting at all, the androids were designed to be killed. Which brings further context to why the commander still orders the androids to fight robots, so that one day, all of the androids could be wiped out. But that's not the end of it. There is one more reveal about the main character of the game, 2B, in that her name isn't actually 2B. See, in this game, androids get their names based on the job they perform. 2B's real designation is 2E, which is a way of saying she's an executioner unit, a secret type of android where her main purpose is to kill android units, specifically 9S. This helps explain the distance between 9S and 2B during the events of the A route, and why so many of their excursions on Earth end with 9S dying. She didn't want to get too close to 9S because she would have to end up killing him anyway. This reveal also explains the cryptic line that 2B gives at the end of the A route.
It always ends like this.
2B isn't evil though. Although her job was to make sure 9S never learned the truth, and if he did, to kill him to remove his memories, she truly regretted having to kill him multiple times. 9S of course doesn't listen to this, since due to the logic virus he is in no position to. So he decides to fight A2 until either himself or she is dead. This route is called the C and D route for a reason. You are given the choice to either play as A2 or 9S for the final battle. Choosing to play as A2 will get you the C ending, and playing as 9S will get you the D ending. The fight, as previously mentioned 25 minutes ago, is fun no matter who you choose. You're going to be seeing both sides of this fight anyway, as in order to get the conclusion of the game in the E route, you have to play both of these fights to their completion. However, no matter who you choose to side with for the fight, both of them will end up dying at the end of it, and that is how the C and D route concludes. A very dark end to the game, and that's pretty much how the C and D route was in general. It was much more somber compared to the early game, with many dark moments lining up the entire thing from beginning to end, and that ending not really feeling hopeful at all. The C and D route is definitely where NieR Automata peaked in terms of narrative and gameplay, making a route that's much better than the early portions of the game. But that's not where NieR Automata concludes. There is one more section to talk about. As the credits roll, the pods that accompany the androids throughout the game will talk about how they feel down about the completion of their goal. They will ask you if this ending is satisfying to you. If you say no, the final boss of the game appears. The credits. In the final section of the game, you will be playing one of 9S's hacking minigames as you fight against the credits. It is a long fight, as you have to get through every single name that was a part of the project. Getting hit 3 times will send you back to the last checkpoint you reached. This is really hard, if not impossible, especially later in the credits where the projectiles are just too hard to dodge. You'll get a transmission from other players that have beat this point in the game, and they will join your ranks, making the fight much easier. These are real players too, and with them makes the only way to beat this possible. This was a great finale. It was immensely challenging, but it also served the game's story well, and had a very climactic feel to it. Beating this gauntlet of a credits roll will lead to one final cutscene to end the game off. But before I get into that, I want to talk about my thoughts on NieR Automata as a whole. NieR Automata isn't perfect. It's got portions of the game I don't like. In my opinion, and I can't believe I'm saying this, maybe NieR Automata would have worked better if it didn't have the 5 separate routes, as there are only a few instances where it works well, and there are many more where it doesn't. But NieR Automata was still a really good game. The story might have had its ups and downs in terms of quality, but as a whole, it was really good. The combat was pretty fun, the world, atmosphere, and music were great, and overall, it was just a really fun time. I probably wouldn't call this one of my favorite games ever, but I'm really happy I played it. And this game clearly had a lot of love and ambition poured into it. The ending of NieR Automata is very open-ended. The pods decide to rebuild A2, 2B, and 9S. They question whether or not it was the right decision to revive them, as they could easily just kill each other as soon as they wake up. But they still hope that a better future for the 3 will happen. And the game ends there. It doesn't disclose whether or not the new future will be different than the one that came before. At the end, the pods will ask you one more question. Do you want to sacrifice your save file in order to help someone else get to the end of the game? As the players that helped you get to the end also sacrifice their save files to do so. Whether or not you choose to help someone is up to you.
Everything that lives is designed to end.
They are perpetually trapped in a never-ending spiral of life and death. However, life is all about the struggle within this cycle. That is what we believe.
Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in December.